Hi, I'm Kelly Karavousanos. I am a licensed professional counselor and I work for Family Life Counseling in St. Charles County, more in O'Fallon, and serving the county area. So today I'm here to talk about coping with caregiver stress in times of crisis. So, to me, I really think that most of us can identify with caregiver stress. And we have many, many reasons to feel this way. Could be that we're in the middle of a pandemic, and could be that there's a lot of fear going around right now about either getting sick, somebody we love being sick. We have a lot of grief over the loss of our loved ones, loss of uh, things that we used to find to be very normal that now we can't do anymore. We have the stress of ever changing rules at work in our community. We have a lot of uncertainty about the future. There's a lot of reasons to be stressed, and there's no shortage of reasons that we could probably fill this whole time frame with reasons why we have to be stressed. But today we're going to focus specifically on being in the helping profession and the kind of stress that happens when we are helping others. So, we're going to talk about the effects of compassion fatigue and secondary trauma. We're going to identify areas for development and resilience and apply those strategies for building resilience. So today we're going to talk about burnout and secondary trauma. So Charles Figley, who is one of the main researchers in compassion fatigue, would be who you would want to research if you want more information on this topic. But he says that burnout and compassion fatigue are definitely an occupational hazard of caring service providers. So if you provide a service for students, for clients, for anyone in need, then you are a caring service provider. So burnout and compassion fatigue are common in helping professions, and more people are recognizing the importance of working toward recognizing it within themselves. So burnout can look like feeling emotionally exhausted, having nothing left in your bucket to give anyone else. My own personal first experience with burnout was pretty early in my career. I had worked for a couple of years in community mental health, drug and alcohol rehabilitation, and I also worked as a social worker for the Division of Public Health and Senior Services. I was graduating with my master's degree in counseling, and I remember telling a co-student that I really don't know why I went through all that because I didn't feel like I had anything else to give. No one had talked about burnout or compassion fatigue in any of our classes. I really felt overwhelmed by even the simplest of tasks. And I didn't know then that that's what I was experiencing. I didn't know that I had compassion fatigue symptoms, and I didn't know that I was experiencing that. And honestly, when I talked to others in the field, I was told that I needed to kind of harden up if I wanted to continue being a caring, helping service provider. And about this time is when I left the field, actually, and I went to explore other options. And I really got passionate about understanding self care and resiliency. So each of you has a heart for caring for others. You know children who've experienced abuse, loss. You know children that are coming to school hungry. You know their stories and you've listened to their pain as well as their joys. You see their struggles and you do what is within your scope of ability to help support them where they are. But as a witness to those stories, you bear the psychological, emotional effects of that, which is secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. So, unlike acute trauma, the stressor that has been this pandemic is ongoing and has the potential to cause chronic stress. So, it's a pretty important topic to know and to understand. So the facts on compassion fatigue, it is truly, as Figley says, the cost of caring. So, compassion fatigue is the byproduct of empathetic engagement with individuals who have experienced trauma. It is a cumulative effect that can deepen over time as you have more and more exposure to trauma. It's important to note, and I think that sometimes our professions will give us the impression that if we're experiencing any of these symptoms, it's really more of a personal failing, that we don't have the skills to cope. And I really want to address that for a second, because I feel that that is, even with the skills, what people are experiencing right now with the amount of stress and the layers that we're all experiencing. So compassion fatigue existed prior to this pandemic, prior to March of 2020. So now we're adding this extra layer of COVID and the pandemic. So we need to understand that this is not a personal failing if you're experiencing symptoms. But what is your responsibility is to raise awareness, take some of the skills that we talked about today, and just really doing a good job at being aware of where you are. And we'll talk more about that as we go. It's also not work-related stress. So I know that it's listed on here. Sometimes I just want to burnout and compassion fatigue are specifically related to helping professions. So it's important to recognize that it's not just, an increased workload. It is more about the emotional engagement that you have with those you serve. So some symptoms of burnout and compassion fatigue are physical and psychological and spiritual in nature. I'd like you to take a moment to read through these. I won't read them to you, but I want you to, and part of resiliency and what we'll talk about later is just understanding and connecting the dots between these symptoms and your experience and where you are. So, do you recognize any of these symptoms in yourself or others? At the end of the program today, I'll give you the website where you can take an assessment that will also help you recognize them, any of these symptoms if they're there. I often suggest that people in the helping professions take this self-assessment every 6 months, because compassion fatigue isn't something that you arrive at. It's an occupational hazard that happens throughout the lifetime of a career. And so it's important to check in periodically to see where you are. So that's something that I think is really important. The cost of caring, again, that's how Charles Figley describes compassion fatigue. The more empathetic that you are, the more vulnerable you are to secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue. Kind of what makes you really, really good at what you do is also what makes you really, really vulnerable to these symptoms and to compassion fatigue. Often people will ask me, well, how do I know if I'm empathetic? How do I know if I'm too empathetic? Or how do I know if I'm not empathetic enough? But I think that if you ask yourself questions and maybe you drive home and you're thinking about somebody you served that day, something that you're taking home, some of this information that you feel deeply for them, then you know that you're empathetic. Most people I know end up on a spectrum. So at one end or the other, and their ability to be empathetic. So it's important to know where you fall on that so that you can really understand where you are. The deeper that you feel, the more affected you are by compassion fatigue. So I want everyone to take a moment to read through these common misconceptions that increase the incident of compassion fatigue. Oftentimes people think that if they care enough, everything will be okay. And believing some of these misconceptions can really put you at risk, because it will isolate you from the connections and the resources that you need to continue to do your job well. Nobody operates in a vacuum. I know sometimes we believe that I remember early in my career just really believing that if I really worked hard and I, spent this extra time doing stuff, that the person that I was serving would appreciate what I was doing and this extra time that I was giving to this problem, and that that's just a big misconception because it's not accurate. Not all people appreciate the time and the energy and the emotional connection that you put into it. Sometimes we believe that we can do it all alone, and or that nobody else is as capable as we are. So we also need to understand that we don't operate in a vacuum, that we do need to really depend on others, and it does take a village to provide the services that you provide. Another misconception is that significant people in your life will understand and support your mission. And that's just not accurate as well. So it's something that can increase. Some people just don't understand what it is that you're going through. So please, be aware that some of these things will really increase that incidence of compassion fatigue. It just adds that extra layer of stress because they are misconceptions and distortions. So important to know those. This is not an exhaustive list, so please know that sometimes it's helpful to reach out, and when someone is experiencing compassion fatigue, oftentimes it's helpful to take the assessment that I talked about that's going to be at the end of the presentation, speak with a counselor or a mentor or a colleague about what you're experiencing to help get an outside perspective, because some of these things you may not even really realize that you're thinking because they've become such habits. That's what we do. We really just they become a habit, and then we don't realize how much that habit might not be doing more damage than helping. Compassion fatigue, and this is one of my favorite quotes, and it best describes compassion fatigue, is the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. So feel free to print that out and hang it up somewhere as a daily reminder that we don't get to walk through water without getting wet, and we don't get to sit with someone in their pain and not feel their loss. So one of the when people ask me, how do you do your job, or, what's the most stressful part of your job? I would say that the most stressful part of my job is sitting with people who are suffering and being with them and not trying to fix or remove or, explain it away, but really truly just sitting and being with them. So that's really something that takes some skill. It takes some good self-care. It takes a whole lot of patience, and it also takes a bit of self-awareness to know when it's been too much, or when you might need to take a minute to dry off because you've been walking through that water all day long. So important, something, I just think this is one of my favorite quotes, so feel free to print that out. So the effects of the pandemic on compassion fatigue, traumatic stress, and burnout are pretty important. And I think that, all of this compassion fatigue and the symptoms that we talked about all existed before March of 2020. But now we must add in all of the effects of the pandemic on ourselves and the populations we serve. So when we talk about the effects of the pandemic, I want you to think about these aren't just the effects on the population that we're serving, but also on ourselves. So we have all these extra added layers of isolation, heightened anxiety and fear. Some people might be experiencing job loss and financial stress, balancing work and home life. Many people have been exposed to illness and death, and maybe if they haven't even been exposed by it firsthand, you're hearing about it every day. You're hearing about loss, and you're hearing about, so that heightened anxiety and fear is huge for people, creating anxiety. And then lastly, exacerbated inequalities. We're seeing that happen. And I know that people are seeing that in schools as well as in the community. So the pandemic is lasting longer and causing more chronic stress. And our bodies are in a constant state of alertness, despite maybe not having any immediate danger. But that psychological piece of it is pretty important to really understand. So Dr. Dan Siegel states that if you can name something, you can tame it. And I often use that in my practice with people. When you experience something and a significant tension, a significant stressor, turmoil, if you can name it, you can actually reduce the stress by 50% by simply noticing and naming your state, noticing where your body is, noticing what it is you're experiencing. So by having these compassion fatigue, burnout, secondary traumatic stress definitions and symptoms and all the information that you're gathering today, it's important to take that time every day to really name where it is that you are, because of the moment that you name it, the tension and the effect that it has on your psychological stress, on your physical stress is reduced by 50%. So that's pretty significant. So just if even just naming it, it's kind of like that time where, you've had a really, really bad day and, a lot of these things can happen, and you call a trusted colleague and you're talking about it. And as you're talking about it, you say, I'm just really sad. I'm sad that this, child is experiencing this, and I'm sad for them. Just even naming that reduces your tension, reduces your stress by 50%. So talking through things and naming them is pretty important. So next we're going to talk about the characteristics of resiliency. I think that a characteristic is defined as a quality or trait. And obviously this list here is not exhaustive, but it's a good beginning of identification and can kind of help you, again, come back to that self-assessment, see where you are on some of these things, and work towards building some of these characteristics. And I think that some things were, obviously some things we come upon naturally, and they seem to be very natural part of our engagement with others, and some that we have to be a little bit more intentional about. So I'd like to talk about a few of them. So optimism is obviously being able to see the positive through the negative. I was running a support group the other day on with individuals who had lost a spouse, and one of the women in that group said that we were talking about secondary losses to the loss of her husband. And she was talking about some of those losses, and she said, but I want to tell you about something I've gained. And so she shared with the group this gain that she had had. And what had happened is that after her husband died, her daughter had stepped in, and that relationship with her daughter had shifted and changed and strengthened. And she said, I'm really so grateful that I have this, this strengthened relationship with my daughter. And, that is just a beautiful example of that optimism, that in the midst of, negatives, in the midst of pain and loss, she was able to point out this amazing this amazing gain that she had. And that's what she called it. She said, I want to talk about my gains, not just my losses. So I think that's pretty amazing. So being able to see the positive through the negative. Optimism doesn't mean a Pollyanna kind of attitude where you don't see the negative at all, but it does mean that you would start to maybe be intentional about seeing that through the negatives, there are still positive outcomes. Another resilient characteristic is realistic expectations. So being able to accept what we cannot change and focus on what can be changed. Oftentimes with clients, I'll talk with them about finding really what's in their circle of control. So will do a little exercise where we have a circle, and then an inner circle and an outer circle. So what's within that circle are things that you actually do have the power to control. So you have the power to control your thoughts, your words, your reactions, but you don't have the power to control what other people do, what other people think. So understanding what is realistic helps in resiliency, helps to be that bounce back. Um, Unrealistic expectations are often resentments waiting to happen. And that's kind of something that I try to come back to all the time. Are my expectations realistic? Because if they're not, they're really setting me up for resentment. Another resilient characteristic is having a strong moral compass, strong sense guiding you through what is right and wrong. And I think that, again, that helps people come back to that, having that sense and purpose and mission and commitment, which is also a resilient characteristic. So, another one that I wanted to point out is faith, a belief in something bigger than yourself. Obviously, that is a part of resiliency, and it's a characteristic that helps you really understand that not everything rests solely on your shoulders, that there is something bigger than yourself that can help you overcome the difficult and pieces of life that do exist. Lastly, I wanted to point out that social support is seeking out social support, using your social support network is a huge resilient characteristic. We have to pull people into our network. We have to be able to ask for help. Being able to overcome negative experiences and negative things that we go through in our lives and trauma is being able to really build those networks and have strong social support. So when you're hurting, when you're suffering, or when you just need somebody else, being able to extend your hand and reach out is really an important part of being able to recover. So really important characteristics, and kind of give yourself some time to assess where you are on with all of these different characteristics, and kind of build your list of what are your own resilient characteristics. Obviously, this is not extensive and it's not absolute, so there's many characteristics out there, but it's really important to know where you fall and what are your characteristics that help you build and overcome. So oftentimes one tool for doing that is looking back on the things that you have already overcome. So if you have been through, which most of us have been through, difficult times in our lives, looking back and seeing, well, what helped me through that? And really understanding that, those are the things that are going to help you through today. Resiliency skill number one, self-reflection. I've kind of been alluding to this throughout the presentation today, but it is really important to take some time to self-reflect, to build awareness, to build insight, to build perspective. I think taking time to understand what affects you most deeply is pretty important. What type of scenarios contribute to your stress level and increase your vulnerability to compassion fatigue. We all have them. One of the things that I share with people is that this was very evident to me when I had some time working in a funeral home. And at the time that I was working there, I was working with a family whose young child had died, and that young child was the same age as my child at the time. And, it isn't that I would not be affected at all, but I was even more deeply affected because of the experience and the connection that I had with that mother. And so knowing what affects us most deeply. Maybe you're working with someone who reminds you of a family member, maybe, or yourself. But understanding those things and having some self-awareness that, yeah, this was pretty hard today because I really connected with this family. You're not going to connect with everyone in that deep level, but you are going to have people that you connect with and that you have that deeper connection and are changed by. So it's important to know what those are, and it takes a little bit of self-reflection and vulnerability to be able to really to know that and to kind of assess that within yourself. So I think also knowing, continuing to learn, are there books, articles, skills you can develop that will support your effort to increase awareness of how you are being affected? I alluded to the professional quality of life scale. I'm going to give you that email address at the end of this program so that you can go and take that assessment. Um, Also, I think that I do want to say that the last here it says taking time for self reflection. Um, I don't know about anybody else, but I feel like every day I get busier and busier, and I could probably fill my schedule from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. and have no time to self reflect. But we have to even build that time in to really process what we've been through. Typically, our society is boom, boom, boom. We got to, get to work. Then after work, pick up kids, make dinner, do, all the things that come with, living in today's world. It's typically we don't have that, sitting on the porch and, looking out and just relaxing at the end of our day. It's just not something that I know a whole lot of people build into their day. I know some of them do, but take time to reflect. And you can do that by journaling, you can do that by building in time with a mentor. However you do it, just make sure that it gets done, because it's pretty important, and it will help you build that resiliency to counter the effects of compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress. This next resiliency skill is building self-regulation. So really understanding your boundaries. Resilient people understand there is a separation between who they are and the cause of their temporary suffering. Being able to say no, being able to get some escape, some play, some rest. Ultimately, being able to disconnect from the everyday compassion fatigue type work is pretty important. I mean, there was a time in my career where I was, providing services basically what felt like maybe 40 to 60 hours a week, most sometimes even on the weekends, and there just was no time to disconnect. And we have to really to repair, to take time to build that resiliency, to have something put back in your bucket. We definitely need to build in time to escape and play and rest. I tell people all the time, I feel like we have a bucket inside of us, and that bucket is what we give out every day when we go and we're helping a child who's struggling, or providing counseling services, or helping someone who, find a way to get money to get food to put on their table. We're giving. So we give out of this bucket, right? And there's some things that put back in it that are provided through our career. We're going to talk about compassion satisfaction as well. So that puts back in. But the other part is our responsibility. And our responsibility as human beings is to understand that that bucket is not endless, that we absolutely need to be able to put back into that bucket. And we do that when we have good boundaries, when we escape, play, and we rest, when we limit traumatic exposure. So one of my limits is that I don't watch the news, and that may seem very disconnected of me, but I'll be honest that I feel like if something pretty big is happening in this world, somebody's going to tell me about it, right? So I know that I have to hear I have to hear this and sit with people all day long who are struggling. The last thing I need to do is come home and then really, commit to more exposure to things I don't have any control over. So limiting traumatic exposure is just one example that we can do. So healthy boundaries, I do think that being able to say no and really stepping back to think about whether how we want to respond before we respond is important. I tell people now, let me think about that. And that gives me, I try to ask people to give me 24 hours before I commit to something above and beyond my daily commitments, because I want to make sure that it truly is something that I can commit to. Because when we say yes, when we mean no, that often always leads to resentment. So be sure you're saying yes because you want to say yes. The last piece of this is body awareness. Um, our body really does speak to us, and sometimes if we learn to get quiet and listen, we can hear what it's saying. Maybe your body's telling you that it's time that you need to get extra rest, that you need to step away, that you need more rest than what you're getting. So taking some time to really be aware of what your body's telling you is also a pretty good resiliency skill. So keeping those things in mind. The next piece of that is the next skill is renew purpose and fulfillment. Um, why do you do the work that you do? What does it provide for you? I think that many times when I talk to people in the helping professions and I say to them, why do you do what you do? Um, I think we get an answer pretty quickly. We do it to help people. We do it to provide, what may not be there. We also do it to provide a sense of pride for ourselves because we want to feel good about being able to give to others. So celebrate your wins as part of that. So understand why you do what you do, and then also celebrate your wins and celebrate your accomplishments. Take time. I think that, one theorist does provide some information about how we think and why we need to be intentional about things. And he says that our brains are like Teflon for the positive and like Velcro for the negative. So when we get through our day, we can go through our day and we can have, you know, had great day, but maybe at the end of the day, you had that one person who was just, told you you weren't helping, or, you had a bad interaction with, or you couldn't help, or whatever it was that interaction was, it was negative. Um, Chances are when you went to bed that night, you weren't thinking about all the wins that you had. Chances are you were thinking about that one negative experience and how it shaped you. So really try to, when I say celebrate wins, what I really mean to is to take time to sift through all of that and notice what it is that, notice the good things that you're doing, notice the positives, because it's just too easy for the negative. Our brain automatically goes to what is, what was that negative piece that happened? How can I make that not happen again? But chances are there was a whole lot of positive that you can try making happen again. So take those time to celebrate your wins and focus on, that's related to that optimism characteristic, right? So coming back and notice the good in your day. Advocate for yourself and your purpose. That can also help you renew purpose and fulfillment. So, think about what your needs are. Are there needs that are not being met? Do you need to take the time to, fulfill those needs? Who can help you? Who can you pull in? Using that social support system, how can you pull that in? So advocate for yourself and your purpose. Last resiliency skill we're going to talk about today is the ability to release emotions and experiences. So, being able to, I was talking with someone the other day and we were talking about not, this particular person as a teacher, and she was saying that throughout her day, she's been has these feelings about things. And this is how she described it. She said, I have a feeling about something, and because I can't do anything with it at that moment, I just tuck it away. And then I tuck it away again. And then I tuck it away again. And then by the end of a week, a month, I've tucked so much away that it just ends up bursting out. So one of the things that her and I talked about, and it's definitely one of these resiliency skills that we can build, is to take time to release the emotions and talk about the experiences. And there's no shortage of ways that you can do that. You can do that through exercise, you can do that through journaling, building those supportive relationships, prioritizing close relationships in your life, and maybe even seeking out counseling. I really think it's important when we talk about those close relationships and building relationships to seek out and surround yourself with other resilient people. Look for people who can just be with you, rather than fixing you or avoiding a conversation or saying, you know what, I don't really want to know about all that. Let's talk about something happy for a change, which unbelievably that does happen. So seek out the people that can be supportive of you and really be with you. But it is important to release emotions and untuck all those things that you tuck in throughout your day. And finding a way to do that is really important, because you don't want to build that up. I was telling somebody my own experience, and that was many years ago, around the same time that I felt like I was experiencing that burnout. I was in the movie theater. We were watching a sad movie, and I started to have tears, which was very normal. Everybody else in the theater was having tears. But then I started crying, maybe a little bit out of proportion for where everybody else was. And I actually ended up having to leave the theater. And at the end of the day, when I did some thought on, I had some self-reflection on what happened. And the reflection I had was that I had tucked away so much, and then I had at this movie theater opened a door, and all of those things that I had been tucking away just spilled out. So I, from then on, tried to be more intentional about releasing those emotions. So obviously, I am a counselor, so I'm also going to root for getting yourself into counseling, because if you're helping others, it's so important to have that feedback, that objective person who can help you build those skills. So, last word on compassion satisfaction. So, we've talked a lot about compassion fatigue, but I do want to spend a few minutes talking about compassion satisfaction, because this is truly what helps us. This may be why you do what you do, and it does help balance out the compassion fatigue. It's definitely puts into your bucket when you get rewarded by the caregiving work that you're doing. So having meaningful relationships, making a positive impact, having pleasure and satisfaction derived from working in a and with helping someone, and really just truly believing that you make a difference. Having those beliefs and knowing those things to be true is compassion satisfaction. It is what balances out compassion fatigue. When we have strong satisfaction, we will have lowered compassion fatigue. So just know that you do need to look for those, and it is okay to feel good about the work that you're doing and to really celebrate that. So it's kind of that moment that you let out a really big sigh and remember that this is all worth it. Obstacles for self-care. Well, we can create a lot of obstacles for self-care. This obviously is also not an exhaustive list, but I hear all the time that I can't do any of these things because I just don't have time. Well, I will tell you that I don't know that you have the luxury of not making time. This is such an important topic that if you are not making time, you will burn out. You will not be in a place where you're not providing the kind of care that you want. It will take its toll on your physical and mental health, and your spiritual health. So please take the time, make the time, be intentional about it. I understand there's already less energy and willpower when we're burnt out. I've been there and done that and had to take my own kind of hiatus from what I was doing. But it's important to really take the time and be intentional about what you're doing. I also want you to know that it's pretty easy to think that we're taking care of things and by using some negative coping skills. So we need to be aware of those and how in relation to the work that we do. So some negative coping skills examples would be, substance abuse, anger, inflexibility, maybe even numbing, kind of zoning out to things. But I also think one of the obstacles is the implied narrative that burnout or compassion fatigue is your fault. It is not any, compassion fatigue is not, look, we're not looking for blame. We're not looking for specifically a cause. If you work in a helping profession, you're exposed to the secondary trauma, which leads to compassion fatigue. You can do all the self care things in the world and still exhibit symptoms of compassion fatigue. It just really, truly is the cost of caring. So in closing today, I'd like you to take a moment to reflect on the information that we had. I encourage you to go. I mean, I know that this information will be available on the website, the PowerPoint. I encourage you to take the assessment, talk with your colleagues about this topic, talk about what you see in yourself and this in your groups and in your institution, wherever you are. Talk about how this is playing out in your everyday. Um, Talk about what resilience practices can you do. Can you partner up with somebody you work with, a colleague? Can you help mitigate some of these symptoms by working on these resiliency practices and self-care? And when it comes to the pandemic and when it comes to, that added layer of stress that everyone is experiencing, that chronic stress, be specific about what aspects of your life that were pre-pandemic that you do want to return to. We've all had to slow down and make huge changes. So what does it look like as things change? All right. Well, in closing, I would like to thank everyone for being here today and for tuning in. I want you to take the time to take the assessment. As always, I'm in the community and I'd be happy to answer any questions or talk to anybody about this topic. Thanks.